"There is something I should have told you 15 years ago," Noah Bennett said in a voice so quiet I almost wondered if I had imagined it. "If I stay silent one more day, I will spend the rest of my life wishing I had found the courage." I stood frozen beside my father's freshly covered grave, unable to answer. The late afternoon wind drifted through the old cemetery in Maple Grove, carrying the scent of damp grass and fallen leaves. One by one, the neighbors who had attended the funeral quietly returned to their cars, leaving only the sound of distant church bells and the rustling branches of the enormous oak tree where Noah stood waiting. I had not seen him in 15 years, yet somehow he looked exactly the way I remembered. His dark brown hair was shorter now, touched with the faintest hint of silver near his temples. His shoulders had broadened with age, but his calm blue eyes had not changed at all. They were still the same eyes that had watched me strike out during Little League games, celebrated every high school victory, and silently stood beside me through every disappointment we faced growing up together. I had spent years convincing myself that leaving Maple Grove had been the only way to build the future I wanted. My career as an architect had carried me from Chicago to Seattle and finally Boston. Every promotion, every new project, every award seemed to prove I had made the right decision. Yet standing there beside my father's grave, surrounded by familiar hills and familiar faces, success suddenly felt much smaller than I remembered. Some places have a way of reminding you who you were before the world convinced you to become someone else. Noah stepped closer, stopping only a few feet away. Neither of us reached for a handshake. Neither of us offered an awkward hug. 15 years of silence cannot be erased with ordinary greetings. Instead, he held out a paper cup. "Black coffee," he said softly. "No sugar, just the way you always drank it." I accepted it almost automatically before realizing I had never told anyone in Boston how I took my coffee. Somehow Noah still remembered something I had forgotten people could notice. "You remembered," I said quietly. A faint smile crossed his face. "I never forgot much when it came to you." His words settled somewhere deep inside me. Before I could respond, another family approached to offer condolences, delaying the conversation neither of us seemed ready to have. Noah simply stepped aside and waited patiently beneath the oak tree. Watching him from across the cemetery, I noticed something strange. He never looked impatient. He never checked his watch. It was almost as though he had already spent years waiting for this exact moment. After the last visitor left, the cemetery grew completely silent. Noah looked toward the fading sunlight stretching across the rows of headstones before turning back to me. "Do you remember Miller Lake?" he asked. I nodded. "Of course. Meet me there before sunset," he said. "There are things you deserve to know, and I cannot explain them here." He began walking toward the cemetery gate before stopping one final time without looking back. "Everything you believed about the day you left this town is incomplete, Ethan." Then he quietly disappeared beyond the old stone wall, leaving me alone with a cooling cup of coffee and a question that refused to leave my mind. For 15 years I believed I had left behind nothing more than my hometown. Standing there in the growing silence, I suddenly realized I might have left behind the most important part of my own story. I spent the next hour wandering through Maple Grove without any real destination, hoping the familiar streets might somehow answer the question Noah had left behind. They did not. The old brick diner on Main Street still displayed its hand-painted Friday pie special in the front window. Jefferson High School stood exactly where I had left it, the football field glowing softly beneath the late afternoon sun. The hardware store still carried stacks of flower pots outside its entrance, and children still rode bicycles along sidewalks where Noah and I had raced every summer until sunset. It was unsettling how little the town had changed while I had become someone completely different. Around 6 o'clock, I found myself driving toward Miller Lake almost without thinking. Some habits survive distance better than memory. Noah's blue pickup truck was already parked beside the weathered wooden dock. He stood near the end of it with his hands resting on the railing, looking out across the perfectly still water. The lake reflected the orange sky like polished glass. It looked exactly as it had the last summer before I left. As I walked closer, Noah turned and smiled faintly. "I wondered if you would come." "You knew I would," I answered. He laughed quietly. Maybe I hoped more than I knew. We stood together without speaking for several moments. The silence was comfortable in a way that surprised me. 15 years had passed, Yet standing beside Noah somehow felt familiar enough that conversation no longer seemed necessary. Finally, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a worn white envelope. The edges had yellowed with age, and a small crease ran across one corner, but it had been preserved with remarkable care. My name was written across the front in neat handwriting I recognized immediately. Ethan Carter. Nothing else. No address. No stamp. What is this? I asked. Noah looked down at the envelope before placing it gently into my hands. Something I wrote the night before you left Maple Grove. I stared at him in disbelief. 15 years ago? He nodded once. I was supposed to give it to you the next morning. Why did you not? Noah rested both hands on the dock railing again, watching the lake instead of me. Because by the time I finally found the courage, your truck was already driving away. The answer settled heavily between us. I carefully traced my thumb across the old paper without opening it. Somehow the unopened envelope felt heavier than it should have. You kept this all these years? I asked quietly. Every move. Every apartment. Every season. His voice remained calm, but I could hear the emotion beneath it. There were times I thought about throwing it away. I never could. A gentle breeze rippled the surface of the lake. Somewhere across the water a loon called into the evening, and for a brief moment I was 16 again, sitting on this same dock after a long day of fishing with the one person who had always understood me without needing explanations. I slowly broke the seal. Inside were 3 folded sheets of lined notebook paper. The handwriting belonged to the Noah I remembered from high school, slightly less polished, but unmistakably his. The first page began simply by thanking me for years of friendship. The second described memories I had nearly forgotten, baseball games, camping trips, late-night conversations beneath the stars, and quiet afternoons spent planning futures neither of us could imagine. Then I reached the final page. My breathing slowed as I read a sentence that seemed to stop time itself. If I never find the courage to tell you how much you truly mean to me, I hope one day you will still know that every dream I ever had somehow included you. I lowered the letter, unable to find a single word. Noah finally looked at me with eyes that held 15 years of patience. That letter is only the beginning, he said softly, because the biggest secret was never written on those pages. I could not stop staring at the last sentence of the letter. The ink had faded slightly over 15 years, but every word still carried the weight of a truth that had waited patiently for me to discover it. I folded the pages carefully and slipped them back into the envelope before looking at Noah again. He had not moved. He simply stood beside the dock with the calm expression I remembered from childhood, as though he had already accepted every possible outcome long before this evening arrived. You said the letter is only the beginning, I finally said. What could be bigger than this? Noah took a slow breath and looked across the lake where the last light of sunset shimmered across the water. Do you remember the week before you left for Chicago? I nodded. Of course. My house was filled with moving boxes. Your father asked me to come over while you were packing. That memory returned immediately. Noah had spent nearly the entire afternoon helping me carry furniture into the rental truck. We joked about how terrible I would be at cooking for myself and argued about which baseball team would finally win the championship. It had felt like an ordinary goodbye between lifelong friends. I remember, I said. What about it? Noah reached into his jacket again and removed a small folded piece of paper. Unlike the letter, this page looked newer, protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. Your father gave me permission to keep this after he passed away, he said quietly. He handed it to me. I unfolded the page and instantly recognized my father's handwriting. The short note was addressed to Noah, not me. Noah, if Ethan ever learns the truth, let it happen when he is ready, not when you are lonely. Help him build the life he deserves, even if it means he builds it without you. I read the note twice before my eyes drifted back to Noah. He wrote this to you? Noah nodded. The night before you moved. I struggled to understand what I was hearing. Dad knew. He knew enough. Noah's voice remained gentle. He knew I cared about you more deeply than I had ever admitted out loud. I looked back at the note, remembering every conversation I had ever shared with my father during those final weeks before leaving Maple Grove. He had encouraged me to chase my dreams, but I always believed he secretly wanted me to stay close to home. Now that belief began to crumble. He asked you to convince me to leave? I whispered. Noah lowered his eyes. I tried to argue with him. I told him you should stay with your family. He smiled, and said that parents spend their whole lives preparing their children to leave, even when it breaks their hearts. My chest tightened. For 15 years I had carried quiet guilt for moving away while my parents grew older without me. Now I discovered they had been the ones pushing me toward that future all along. So the conversation we had that night. I began. Noah nodded before I could finish. When I told you not to give up the opportunity in Chicago, I was repeating your father's words, not mine. I remembered sitting on my back porch after dark while Noah patiently listened to every fear I had about leaving. He had somehow found exactly the right words to convince me that chasing my dream was not selfish. I thought they had come from his own heart. In truth, they had come from a promise he made to my father. I looked at Noah with growing disbelief. You knew helping me leave might mean never seeing me again. He smiled sadly. Yes. And you still did it. Because loving someone sometimes means protecting the future they cannot see yet. The evening breeze carried another ripple across the lake. I searched Noah's face for regret, but found only quiet peace. Then he looked at me and spoke words that changed everything once again. There is one person who can prove I am telling you the truth, he said softly. Tomorrow morning, I want to take you to see someone who has been waiting almost as long as I have. The next morning arrived wrapped in a cool autumn breeze that carried the familiar scent of pine trees and fresh coffee drifting through Maple Grove. I barely slept the night before. Noah's letter, my father's handwritten note, and the quiet certainty in Noah's voice had replayed in my mind until sunrise. At exactly 9 o'clock, his blue pickup truck pulled into the driveway of my parents' house. He stepped out wearing the same forest green jacket, offering only a small smile before asking, "Ready?" I nodded without asking where we were going. Somehow I trusted that the answers I had spent 15 years searching for were finally waiting ahead. 20 minutes later, we stopped in front of a small white cottage with flower boxes beneath every window. The porch looked exactly as I remembered from high school. "Mrs. Parker?" I asked in surprise. Noah smiled gently. "She has been expecting you." Before I could knock, the front door opened. Evelyn Parker, my former English teacher, stood there with the same kind eyes that had encouraged countless students over the years. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, and although time had softened her features, her warm smile remained unchanged. "Ethan Carter," she said with genuine happiness. "You finally came home." She embraced me warmly before inviting both of us inside. Her living room looked like a small library. Books covered nearly every wall, family photographs rested on wooden shelves, and sunlight poured through lace curtains onto an old oak coffee table. After serving tea, she looked at Noah and quietly nodded. Without saying a word, he walked toward a cabinet and carefully removed a thick manila folder that had clearly been stored there for many years. He placed it in front of me. My name was written across the front in black ink. "Open it," Mrs. Parker said softly. Inside were dozens of familiar papers. My architecture sketches from senior year, competition certificates, scholarship essays, recommendation letters, newspaper clippings about student design awards. Every milestone that had helped launch my career had somehow found its way into one carefully preserved collection. "You kept all of this?" I asked. Mrs. Parker smiled. "No, Noah did." I looked up in confusion. Noah leaned against the bookshelf, almost embarrassed. "You always left your drawings everywhere," he said with a quiet laugh. "Someone had to make sure they did not disappear." Mrs. Parker gently slid one document toward me. It was my scholarship application from 15 years earlier. My eyes moved across the pages until I reached the final section listing everyone who had helped prepare the portfolio. Beneath Mrs. Parker's signature appeared another signature I had never noticed before. Noah Bennett, volunteer portfolio assistant. I stared at the page in disbelief. "You worked on this?" Noah nodded once. "Every afternoon after baseball practice." Mrs. Parker smiled fondly. "Sometimes until 8 or 9 at night. He organized your drawings, photographed your architectural models, corrected printing mistakes, and even drove across the county twice because one of your presentation boards came back with the wrong color." My mind searched desperately through old memories. Every evening Noah had claimed he was too busy to meet. Every weekend, he disappeared for a few hours without explanation. I had assumed he was spending time with other friends or helping neighbors. The truth had been sitting quietly inside this folder the entire time. "Why did nobody tell me?" I asked. Noah answered before Mrs. Parker could speak. "Because the scholarship belonged to you, not to me." Mrs. Parker reached into the bottom of the folder and carefully removed one final object. It was a small cassette, tape inside a clear plastic case. Across the label, written in my mother's familiar handwriting, were 4 simple words that immediately stole my breath away. For Ethan when ready. I held the cassette in both hands as though it might disappear if I moved too quickly. My mother's familiar handwriting instantly carried me back to childhood evenings when she labeled holiday decorations, recipe cards, and birthday gifts with the same careful script. Mrs. Parker quietly walked toward the wooden cabinet in the corner of the room and returned with an old cassette player that looked almost as well preserved as the tape itself. She placed it gently on the coffee table before stepping back. "She asked me to keep this safe," Mrs. Parker said softly. "She believed one day you would be ready to hear it." Noah remained silent beside the bookshelf, giving me the space to decide. My fingers hesitated only for a moment before sliding the cassette into the player. The machine clicked quietly. A soft hiss filled the room. Then I heard the voice I had not heard in years. "Hello, sweetheart." Every muscle in my body froze. It was unmistakably my mother. Warm, gentle, calm. Exactly the way I remembered hearing her every Sunday morning while she prepared breakfast. "If you are listening to this," she continued, "then I hope you have built the life you always dreamed about. I hope you found work that makes you proud and people who make you smile." I closed my eyes as memories flooded back. Family dinners, Christmas mornings, long conversations on our front porch during warm summer nights. For a few precious moments, it felt as though she had simply stepped into the room again. "There are some things parents understand before their children do," she said. "Sometimes loving someone means helping them walk toward a future that takes them far away from you." My eyes slowly opened and drifted toward Noah. He still had not moved. His gaze remained lowered, as though he had already memorized every word on the recording years ago. "Your father and I knew you would never leave Maple Grove if you believed we needed you here," my mother continued. "That is why we asked someone we trusted completely to help you believe in your own future." My heartbeat quickened. I already knew who she meant, but hearing her confirm it carried an entirely different weight. "Noah loved this town," she said gently. "More importantly, he loved the people inside it. When we asked him to encourage you to leave, he argued with us. He wanted you to stay close to your family because he believed that would make you happiest." Your father smiled and told him something I hope you never forget. "Real love is not measured by how tightly someone holds on. It is measured by whether they are willing to let go so another person can become who they were always meant to be." I lowered my head as emotion tightened my throat. For 15 years I had quietly blamed myself for leaving. Now I discovered the people I loved most had been the ones guiding me toward that decision together. My mother's voice softened even more. "There is one last truth I have carried in my heart for a very long time, Ethan. Mothers notice things children rarely notice about themselves. I saw the way Noah looked at you long before either of you understood what those feelings meant. I also noticed the way your smile changed whenever he walked into a room. Whether life eventually brought the two of you together was never something I could predict. But I always hoped that if the truth ever found both of you, neither of you would waste another day pretending not to see it." The tape reached its end with a quiet click. Silence settled across the room. No one spoke. The afternoon sunlight drifting through the windows suddenly felt warmer than before. I slowly looked up at Noah. For the first time since returning to Maple Grove, I realized I was no longer looking at only the friend I had grown up with. I was looking at the person who had quietly shaped nearly every turning point in my life, and I found myself wondering how many memories I would have to relearn before I finally understood the story we had both been living all along. I left Mrs. Parker's house carrying the cassette, the worn envelope, and the thick folder as though they were pieces of a life I had somehow forgotten belonged to me. Noah drove in. Silence, giving me room to think while the quiet roads of Maple Grove rolled past the truck windows. Every familiar place now seemed connected to a memory that no longer meant what I had always believed. The old baseball field where we spent endless summer evenings. The diner where Noah insisted on ordering my favorite pie before I even sat down. The bookstore where he quietly bought me my first architecture magazine because he said every dream deserved something to grow from. None of those moments had felt extraordinary at the time. Looking back now, they formed a pattern so obvious that I wondered how I had missed it for so many years. Noah finally turned onto the road leading toward Jefferson High School. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the football field stretched beneath a clear blue sky. "Why are we here?" I asked. He parked the truck and smiled faintly. "Because this is where I almost told you everything." We climbed the familiar aluminum bleachers and sat near the top, where we used to watch junior varsity games before becoming players ourselves. The stadium looked smaller than I remembered, but the feeling of being there returned instantly. I could almost hear the marching band practicing and classmates cheering beneath Friday night lights. Noah rested his forearms on his knees and stared toward the 50-yard line. "Do you remember the state championship game?" he asked. I smiled. "You caught the winning touchdown in the fourth quarter." He laughed quietly. "Everyone remembers that part." His expression gradually became thoughtful. "What nobody remembers is what happened afterward." I searched my memory. Families celebrated on the field. Coaches gave speeches. Friends gathered for pictures. Then everything blurred together. "You asked me to meet you behind the gym," I said slowly as the memory surfaced. Noah looked at me in surprise. "You remember that?" "Only now." I nodded. I never understood why. He took a deep breath. I waited there almost an hour. The words settled heavily between us. I kept rehearsing what I wanted to say because I was terrified I would lose my courage if I spoke too soon. I looked toward the old gymnasium visible beyond the field. I remembered walking in that direction before my father called my name. My mother had begun feeling unwell, and we left immediately without another thought. "I never came," I whispered. Noah shook his head gently. "You never had the chance." He reached into his wallet and carefully removed a tiny folded piece of paper whose edges had softened with age. "I carried this every day since then." He handed it to me. I unfolded it slowly. There was only one sentence written in the careful handwriting of a 17-year-old boy. "No matter where life takes you, you will always feel like home to me." My chest tightened. Such a simple sentence somehow carried the weight of every unanswered question between us. "I was going to hand it to you after the game," Noah said quietly. "Then your father asked me to help you leave town instead." I looked from the note to Noah, suddenly realizing how impossible those final days must have been for him. He had planned to tell me how he felt, only to choose my future over his own hopes without ever asking for anything in return. "Did you ever regret it?" I asked. Noah thought for a long moment before answering. "I regretted losing time with you," he admitted. "But I never regretted helping you become the person you were meant to be." His words lingered in the quiet stadium as I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my jacket beside the letter and my mother's cassette. For the first time since coming home, I understood that the greatest secret Noah had hidden was never simply that he loved me. It was that he had spent 15 years proving it without expecting me to notice. And I suddenly realized there was one question I could no longer keep inside my own heart. The question stayed with me all the way home. After Noah dropped me off at my parents' house, I sat alone on the back porch long after the sun disappeared behind the trees. The old wooden swing creaked gently in the evening breeze, and for the first time in years I noticed how quiet Maple Grove became after dark. Boston was always filled with traffic, distant sirens, and endless movement. Here, the loudest sound came from crickets hidden in the grass. I reached into my jacket and placed the letter, the folded note, and the cassette on the small table beside me. 3 objects. 3 different moments in time. Together they told a story I had somehow lived without ever fully understanding it. I closed my eyes and replayed memory after memory. Noah teaching me to throw a baseball in elementary school because I kept missing every catch. Noah staying late after science class to help me finish a project even though he had already completed his own. Noah driving 3 hours to watch my college architecture exhibition during my sophomore year without telling me he was coming. I remembered receiving a handwritten card that day congratulating me on the exhibition. There had been no return address, only a short message wishing me luck. At the time I assumed it came from one of my relatives. Now I suddenly wondered if I had been wrong all along. The following morning, I found myself standing outside the old diner before Noah arrived. When his pickup truck pulled into the parking lot, he looked genuinely surprised to see me waiting. "You are early," he said with a smile. "I could not sleep," I admitted. We ordered breakfast and settled into the same corner booth where we used to spend Saturday mornings after fishing at Miller Lake. The waitress greeted Noah by name before turning toward me. "It is nice to see you back, Ethan," she said warmly. "Your friend never stopped ordering your favorite blueberry pancakes whenever he came in. Said it reminded him of the good old days." I looked at Noah. He gave an embarrassed laugh. Old habits are difficult to break. After the waitress walked away, I leaned forward. Can I ask you something? He nodded. Anything. I took a slow breath. Did you ever really move on? Noah looked down at his coffee for several quiet seconds before answering. I built a good life, he said honestly. I have wonderful neighbors, meaningful work, people who care about me, and more blessings than I deserve. But if you are asking whether I ever stopped loving you, the answer is no. There was no drama in his voice. No expectation. No attempt to persuade me. He simply spoke the truth with the same quiet honesty that had always defined him. I searched his face, looking for resentment or regret, but found neither. Instead, I saw peace. Why did you never call? I asked softly. After the birthday messages stopped, why did you let the silence continue? Noah smiled gently. Because every conversation ended with me wanting to say something I promised your father I would never say unless you were ready to hear it. I decided I would rather miss you honestly than place my feelings above your future. His answer left me speechless. I realized then that while I had measured those 15 years by promotions, cities, and accomplishments, Noah had measured them by promises quietly kept. I looked through the diner window, toward the familiar streets outside, and suddenly understood something that had been hiding in plain sight. Every important memory I treasured somehow included him. Every version of home I carried inside my heart had always begun with the same person sitting across from me. I slowly reached across the table and rested my hand over his. Noah looked up, surprised but calm. I think I finally understand what my mother was trying to tell me, I said quietly. The question is whether I am already 15 years too late. Noah held my gaze for a long moment before a gentle smile appeared across his face. There is only one way for both of us to find out, he answered softly. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My hand remained resting gently over Noah's, and the familiar sounds of the diner faded into the background. Coffee cups clinked somewhere behind us. The front door opened and closed as customers came and went, yet everything around me suddenly felt distant. Noah did not pull his hand away. Instead, he smiled with the same quiet warmth that had always made every difficult moment seem a little easier. I spent a long time believing I had already missed my chance, I admitted. I thought coming back here would only remind me of everything I left behind. I never imagined it would help me understand what I had been carrying with me all along. Noah studied my face carefully, as though he wanted to be certain I truly meant every word. Sometimes we only understand the past after we have lived enough of the future, he said softly. His answer lingered with me as we finished breakfast and stepped outside into the cool autumn air. Instead of returning to the truck, Noah nodded toward Main Street. Walk with me. We wandered through town without any destination, passing the bookstore where he had once surprised me with my first architecture magazine, the bakery where my mother always stopped on Saturday mornings, and the small park where we spent countless afternoons talking about college, careers, and dreams that seemed impossibly far away. Every familiar place unlocked another memory. I remembered Noah cheering louder than anyone else when I received my acceptance letter. I remembered him spending an entire weekend helping me pack before I moved away. I remembered how he always insisted on taking photographs of every milestone, even when I complained that pictures were unnecessary. Suddenly, I realized something that had never occurred to me before. Nearly every photograph I still kept from my teenage years had been taken by Noah. He had quietly preserved memories that I never thought to save myself. You were always looking after pieces of my life, I said. Noah gave a small shrug. Someone had to. We both laughed, but this time the laughter carried no sadness. It felt light, effortless, almost familiar enough to erase the years between us. As we reached the edge of town, the road opened toward the overlook above Maple Grove where we used to watch sunsets after football games. Without saying anything, Noah started walking up the trail. I followed. The climb was short, and within minutes the entire town stretched beneath us. The church steeple rose above the rooftops. Miller Lake reflected the afternoon sky, and the narrow streets wound peacefully through neighborhoods that had shaped both of our lives. I came here a lot after you left, Noah admitted. Whenever I needed to remind myself that hoping for good things was never a waste. I looked out across the view before turning toward him. I always thought success would make me feel complete, I said quietly. Every promotion, every award, every new city felt exciting for a while. But somehow every achievement also reminded me there was one person I wanted to tell before anyone else. Noah's eyes widened slightly. You never told me that. Because I never understood why until now. I smiled gently. I kept calling it friendship because that explanation felt safe. It never occurred to me that my heart might have been trying to tell me something I was not ready to hear. A gentle breeze moved through the trees as we stood side by side, overlooking the town. Noah's expression softened, but he remained silent, allowing me to continue in my own time. I reached into my jacket and removed the old letter, the folded note, and my mother's cassette case. Holding them together, I finally understood that they were never simply reminders of the past. They were proof that love could survive distance, silence, and time without demanding anything in return. I slipped them back into my pocket before looking directly at Noah. I do not want the next chapter of my life to become another memory I wish I had understood sooner, I said. Noah smiled, and with quiet hope shining in his eyes, he offered me his hand one more time. For a moment, I simply looked at Noah's outstretched hand. 15 years earlier, I would have accepted it without thinking because he had always been my closest friend. Now I reached for it with a completely different understanding. Our hands met naturally, without hesitation, as though they had finally caught up with a promise time had delayed but never erased. Neither of us spoke right away. We stood together overlooking Maple Grove while the late afternoon sun slowly settled behind the distant hills, painting the lake and rooftops in warm shades of gold. I realized that nothing in the town had truly changed. The church still stood in the center of Main Street. Miller Lake still reflected the sky like polished glass. The old oak trees still lined the quiet roads where we learned to ride bicycles and dreamed about futures too big for a small town. The only thing that had changed was me. I had spent 15 years believing I was searching for success, when in reality, I had been searching for the feeling of home that I unknowingly left behind. Noah looked at me with the same calm blue eyes that had followed me through every season of my life. What are you thinking? He asked quietly. I smiled. I am thinking about how many times I almost called you after something important happened. He looked surprised. Really? I nodded. Every promotion, every new apartment, every award, every birthday. You were always the first person who came to mind, even after we stopped talking. I never understood why. A gentle smile crossed his face. I used to wonder if you ever thought about me. I laughed softly. Apparently, I thought about you more than I was willing to admit. We both laughed, and this time there was no sadness hiding beneath it. The silence that followed felt peaceful instead of uncertain. After a while, Noah reached into his jacket and carefully returned the old letter to me. Keep it, he said. It always belonged to you. I placed the letter beside the folded note and the cassette case inside my jacket pocket. Those three small objects no longer represented years that had been lost. They represented years of quiet love, unwavering loyalty, and extraordinary patience. They reminded me that the strongest feelings are often revealed not through grand speeches, but through ordinary acts repeated with kindness over time. I turned toward Noah and took a slow breath. I cannot change the past, I said. I cannot give us back the years we missed. But I do know one thing. He waited without interrupting. I do not want another 15 years to pass while I pretend I still do not understand what has always been true. Emotion filled his eyes, but his smile remained steady. Neither do I. We began walking back toward his truck together as evening settled over the town. Halfway down the trail, I paused and looked back one final time at the overlook. For years, I believed coming home meant returning to a place. Now I understood that home had never been a street, a house, or even a town. Home had always been the person who quietly believed in me when I doubted myself, protected my dreams before they became reality, and loved me without asking for anything in return. As we reached the truck, Noah opened the passenger door before looking at me with a hopeful smile. Ready? He asked. I smiled back with complete certainty, feeling lighter than I had in years. Yes, I answered. This time I am not leaving anything important behind. Together we drove toward the quiet lights of Maple Grove, not as two people trying to recover the past, but as two hearts finally choosing the future they had unknowingly been walking toward all along.